It's a great pleasure for me to introduce Amanda. Amanda Gefter is a freelance writer specializing in fundamental physics, cosmology, cognitive science, and philosophy. She has a master's degree in the philosophy and history of science from the London School of Economics and was a Knight Science Journalism Fellow at MIT. Amanda has written countless articles about science education, cosmology, elementary particle physics, string theory that have been published in journals like Nature, The New Scientist, Scientific American, The New Yorker, The New York Times, Quantum Magazine, and so on. One of her specialty, as far as I can tell, is to look deeply into these various topics by picking key scientists in the field and to then immerse herself into their biographies. In 2014, she published this wonderful book. I can't see it. Oh, okay, but it's reversed. First passing on Einstein's law, a father, a daughter, the meaning of nothing, and the beginning of everything, which is how I first learned about her. This book is a kind of road movie on her quest to understand the nature of reality and the mysteries of quantum physics that describes her journey across the US with her father, who also is a physicist, to meet with prominent physicists, including Leonard Susskind, Wojciech Zurek, Ed Witten, and Stephen Hawking. Last month, I was very lucky to meet Amanda and her husband in person at the conference on quantum foundation in Sweden, organized by Andrei Krenikov, who's also here as a participant this year, where she gave fascinating presentation on Peter Putnam's life, who was a student of Wheeler. I still regret that I didn't carry a book with me for a signature, but I hope that there will be an opportunity at another occasion. And you can find more about Amanda on her webpage, amandagefter.com. And we are now very much looking forward to your talk, which is titled Quantum Mechanics and the Subject-Object Relation.
Thank you so much. That was such a nice introduction. And let me just share my screen here, and hopefully this works. Okay, let's see. Okay, can you all see that? Okay. And all right. You're still seeing the full screen slide, right?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so thank you so much for being here today, for having me at this meeting. And what I'm going to talk about is the subject-object relation. This is a relation that is so deeply baked into the foundations of modern science, starting back in the 17th century, that it's shaped our thinking like so entirely that we're now at this point where we rarely question it. And throughout this talk, I want to suggest that our kind of misunderstanding of the subject-object relation has given rise not only to these very confounding intellectual puzzles, so things like the measurement problem in quantum mechanics and the hard problem in cognitive science, but also to a rather devastating situation in terms of climate and our relationship to the planet. And so it feels like we're at a bit of a crisis point, both in our scientific theories and in our just existential situation as human beings, and that maybe we could use a new way of looking at the world and at ourselves. And as a way into that, I'm going to tell a story, which is about the legendary physicist John Wheeler and his virtually unknown student, Peter Putnam. Okay. I just want to confirm that slides are advancing. Okay, great. So the story begins in the American Philosophical Society Library in Philadelphia, where I was reading through John Wheeler's journals. And so for anyone who may not know, John Archibald Wheeler was one of the great American physicists. He was this towering figure of the 20th century. He did pioneering work in everything from nuclear physics to general relativity to quantum gravity. He was famous for coining phrases like black hole and wormhole. But his central preoccupation was always the meaning of quantum mechanics, and in particular, the role of the observer in quantum mechanics. And as he struggled with that problem, he kept journals, these large hardbound notebooks that are bursting at the seams with notes and letters and cards. He always had one with him, and he would just write down his every thought and experience. And luckily for us, he donated these notebooks to the American Philosophical Society. So if he was talking with a colleague, he would take notes on the conversation. He would use the journal to plan out his lectures slide by slide. He would use them to run through calculations or just write down his thoughts. If he attended a dinner party, he would draw the seating chart. And I think it's clear that they had fish. Sometimes he would just glue in things that made him laugh. But above all, these journals provide like an amazingly intimate look at Wheeler's brilliant mind at work as he struggled to understand this relationship between observer and observed, between subject and object. So a decade ago, I was in the library. I came across this page labeled Putnam and My Work. And on the side of the page, Wheeler had drawn his famous U diagram. This is his idea of a self-excited universe where the universe gives rise to an observer. So the top of the U on the right-hand side of the letter is supposed to represent the Big Bang. And then as the letter sort of swoops to the left, time is moving forward. At the top of the other peak, an observer is born and opens her one giant eye and looks out at the universe and in doing so, looks back in time, and through the act of quantum measurement, participates in the creation of the same universe that created her. So that was this idea of a self-excited universe. And you can see on the side of the page here, different versions of this diagram that Wheeler tried to work through in the journals. And so on the journal page, Wheeler had written, "Read the little diagram, Putnam says nonsense." And I thought, who is this Putnam who dared tell Wheeler that his idea was nonsense? And why did he matter enough to Wheeler that Wheeler wrote this whole entry about it in his journal? And at first I thought maybe it was Hilary Putnam, who was this famous philosopher at Harvard. But as I kept reading, I soon saw Wheeler use this Putnam's first name, Peter. So Peter Putnam had apparently been one of Wheeler's students. That became clear in the journals. And that was very strange because Wheeler's students were people like Kip Thorne and Hugh Everett and Richard Feynman. Like they all sort of notoriously became very famous physicists. And yet I had never heard of a Peter Putnam. So I went home that night and I searched around online. And if you Google the name Peter Putnam, you will get images of this very large, very orange man in a very tiny Speedo. And as it turns out, this is not the right Peter Putnam. But if you keep on Googling, you will eventually find this obscure article in the Princeton Alumni Weekly newsletter called Brilliant Enigma. And this tells the story of the right Peter Putnam, who came to Princeton as an undergrad in 1946, where Wheeler took him under his wing. So Wheeler brought him to Copenhagen to meet Niels Bohr. Bohr was Wheeler's mentor. Putnam befriended Einstein in Princeton. He was in this really rarefied company, and everyone who met him seemed to think he was really brilliant. Wheeler himself is quoted in the article as saying, "Only 2 or 3 times in my life have I met thinkers with insights so far-reaching, a breadth of vision so great, and a mind so keen as Putnam's." And if you think about all the minds that Wheeler was hanging around with at the time, like that's a pretty remarkable statement. So the article goes on to say that Putnam eventually did his PhD in physics under Wheeler, but then became really interested in how the mind works. he came up with his own theory of brain function. He wrote prodigiously, but rarely ever published anything. He ended up living in rural Louisiana, where he was fighting for civil and gay rights while working as a janitor. And he was living in virtual poverty when in 1987, he was riding his bicycle to work, to his janitor job, and he was struck by a drunk driver and killed. And upon his death, this unknown janitor left $40 million to charity, which it turned out that he had made in the stock market, but never touched a penny of it for himself, although he had commissioned and donated tons of modern sculpture, which is in various outdoor and public spaces all over the US. So if you walk around the Princeton campus, for instance, you'll find this amazing collection of modern sculpture, and all of it was donated anonymously by Putnam. So the one here on the left is a Picasso. The one on the right is a Calder. There's tons of them. This one is called Construction in the Third and Fourth Dimension by Antoine Pevsner. And this one was sort of special because Putnam commissioned it specifically in honor of Niels Bohr. And I remember when I first saw that, I thought it was sort of strange, like Putnam knew Bohr, but not super, super well. Bohr didn't really have any affiliation with Princeton, and yet this stands in the courtyard at Jadwin Hall, which is the physics building at Princeton. And then I realized it stands right outside of Wheeler's office. And so Wheeler would have looked out his window and seen this sculpture. And it occurred to me that this really, in a way, was a gift from Putnam to Wheeler, because Putnam looked up to Wheeler as this kind of father figure and mentor. But he knew that Wheeler looked up to Bohr in that way. And I think it did mean a lot to Wheeler. This is like a newspaper clipping where we see Wheeler laying some flowers on the sculpture in Bohr's memory. Okay, so we've discovered this unknown genius who was friends with Wheeler and Einstein and Bohr, but ended up as a janitor and was living in poverty, but sitting on $40 million. Like, the whole thing is this crazy story, but it was also clear that there was something deeper to it. So one of the reasons I could tell came from the way that Wheeler talked about Putnam in the journals. And I wasn't the only one to notice this. So Terry Christensen, who's a historian of science, did his thesis on Wheeler's legacy of mentorship, because Wheeler was just famously like this incredible mentor. And after studying Wheeler's relationships with all of his mentees, Christensen wrote the following: "It's interesting to note that John Wheeler wrote and spoke about Peter Putnam at greater length and with more emotion than any other of his students." And Wheeler's youngest daughter, Allison, told me essentially the same thing. I went to visit her at High Island, which had been Wheeler's summer home off the coast of Maine. This was the place that Wheeler most loved in the whole world to go sit and think about the nature of reality. This is actually the official portrait of Wheeler that hangs in the physics department at Princeton. And you see that it depicts Wheeler sitting on the rocks at High Island, and he's writing in one of the journals. So this was like an important place to him. And it was really special to get to go there and talk to his daughter. And while I was there, she showed me many things, but for one, this page from one of Wheeler's scrapbooks where we see Putnam as a grad student. And I asked her how her father's relationship with Peter compared to his relationships with his other graduate students, with Feynman and Everett and Bekenstein, Thorne. And her response was, Johnny spent much, much more time with Peter, and he worried about him much more. He wanted him to be connected to people and not go off on his own. And when I asked her, well, why did he spend so much time with him? Why did he worry about him? Was it just that he cared about him as a person? And she sort of shook her head and paused for a minute and said, it's because he thought he was on to something. And this is the same feeling that I get, for instance, from this letter. So this is a letter that Wheeler wrote to Freeman and Company Publishing House. He was trying to convince them to publish a book by Putnam about Putnam's theory of the brain. And in the letter, Wheeler mentions that he's heard from others that, quote, in 10 years' time, Putnam will be recognized as America's leading philosopher, which is a particularly bittersweet statement because actually in 10 years' time, Putnam would be an anonymous janitor. But Wheeler also added this. Incidentally, I might say that my own selfish interest in this is for the understanding that I'm convinced will come out of it about the deeper implications of the quantum principle, which is really strange and remarkable, because why on earth would a theory of brain function have anything to do with the quantum principle? So to answer that, I want to take a moment to remind you of the history behind all of this, because I think this is really, really critical to understanding not only what happened between Putnam and Wheeler, but to understanding the real meaning of the subject-object relation. So, okay, everyone knows that René Descartes came up with the famous slogan, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. But what many of us seem to have forgotten is why he came up with it. So it's not because he was thinking about the mind. Descartes was working on a new theory of physics. And at the time, there was only Aristotle's physics. And in Aristotle's physics, there was no real distinction between subject and object. This is like hard for us to even fathom now because we're so ingrained in thinking this other way. But, you know, all the things that we typically think of as like subjective, like redness and sweetness and, you know, qualia and all these things, they were not considered like in our heads. They were just part of the world. And at the same time, all the things that were considered objects were not thought of as operating sort of mechanistically, but they had their own sort of goals and feelings that sort of drove them from the inside to do what they did. So like objects fell because they wanted to be closer to the earth, like that sort of thing. So that just objects were sort of infused with subjectivity, and subjectivity was out in the world, and there was just no concept of this idea of like inner and outer, subject and object. And it's amazing to go back in history and sort of read some texts, especially if they're translated well and they're not translated with the kind of Cartesian ideas like, you know, built back onto them, because you just realize like there was a very, very different way of thinking. There was no metaphysical cut between inside and outside, and no concept of this kind of like internal, private, mental realm. And of course, the flip side of that is there was no sort of purely objective mechanistic matter. But that's what Descartes wanted. He had this idea that he wanted to view the world as a machine where he would reduce everything in the universe to just size, shape, and motion. That those would be the things that are real. Because if he could do that, then he could describe all of it as if from the outside, as if you sort of took the knower out of the universe, and then he could use the coordinate systems that now bear his name. So that was like his whole idea. It's like, let me use my coordinate systems to describe everything that's happening in the universe. But to make that work, he had to get rid of everything that wasn't size, shape, or motion. So color and sound, thoughts and ideas, imagination, dreams. He needed some rug to sweep them under. And then he had this idea. He thought, you know, our senses might deceive us. And so we can doubt everything that we see. But the one thing we can't doubt is our doubting. And so there's actually like this asymmetry between the things that we can truly know, because in some sense they're self-knowing, and the things that we can only infer. So he sort of invented this asymmetry, which became a split between inside and outside, subject and object. And now he could take everything that wasn't size, shape, or motion and shove it into this newly subjective mind. So those words, cogito ergo sum, they first appeared in Descartes' treatise on physics. It was a physics move. And it laid the groundwork for Newton's physics. But then the word consciousness had to be coined, like pretty soon after, to describe this self-knowing, thinking stuff that Descartes had invented and then locked away in the head. So in one fell swoop, the subject-object split became the foundation for cognitive science and for physics. So our modern idea of consciousness was the premise on which classical physics was built. And I think this is really key to keep in mind. And it's worth noting that the real move here was to turn the I in on itself, right? To make it self-referential, self-knowing. That's how it carves itself off from the world, becomes something different. That's how you get a split. And then, because by definition, the I can only know itself because it's self-knowing, then the only way it can know the world is to somehow get the world into itself. So we have to like get the outside world into the inside subject. This was never like a problem before this move. And so now the brain's job in Descartes' view became to make an internal model or representation of the external world. That was a new idea. And then the job of physics became to describe that external world as it simply is, independent of our interactions with it, with the observer, on the other side of the split. So you have this new job for the brain, new job for physics. Okay, so Wheeler came to see that this view of physics, classical physics, doesn't work. It's wrong. And of course, he was very influenced by Bohr, his mentor. And Bohr saw that the key insight of quantum mechanics was precisely that Descartes' fixed pre-given subject-object divide can't hold up. So Bohr often put it like this: the finite magnitude of the quantum of action prevents altogether a sharp distinction being made between a phenomenon and the agency by which it's observed. And this is very typical Bohr language. It says so much and so little, and so much is left unsaid. So it's worth taking a moment to unpack, because actually this sentence happens to contain the entire meaning of quantum mechanics. Okay, so the finite magnitude of the quantum of action, this is this little symbol h. Sometimes you'll see it expressed as h bar, where it has a little slash through the top, but we're just going to stick with h. And h has a finite magnitude, Bohr's saying, which means that its value isn't 0. And h is a measure of action. So in physics, action is this term for how energy changes over time. And it was always assumed that energy changes continuously, by any amount whatsoever. But at the dawn of the 20th century, experiments revealed that in actuality, this isn't the case, that the energy emitted over some unit of time always comes in some smallest chunk that can't be further divided. A single indivisible quantum, which goes by the name of Planck's constant, or h. And its actual value depends on your units. So it's 10 to the minus 33 in centimeters, 10 to the minus 43 in seconds. But however tiny it is, it has huge implications for our understanding of reality. And that's because every measurement, every physical interaction always involves an exchange of energy. And so if we want to say something about an object, we have to interact with it, because that's how we find out about things in the world. But then we have to subtract away the effect of our interaction so that we can say something just about the thing in the world. So if I grab this mug because I want to feel how heavy it is, technically speaking, the momentum of my grabbing it contributes to its mass, right? So if I wanted to be super precise about the mass of the mug, I would have to subtract away the effect of my interaction with it. And then I'd be able to say something about the mug as it truly is, or as it was, independent of me before I ever touched it. And if action were infinitely divisible, then I could do that with infinite precision. But when action comes in these units of h, I sort of hit a snag. I can cut away the effect of my measurement, but only down to h, right? And so at h, it's my knife hits something solid. And in that little solid piece, there's just no way to say who's who, which is which. Is it my energy? Is it the mug's energy? It's not divisible. So it somehow belongs to both of us. And it's as if we're entwined or entangled, as physicists say, and can't be decomposed back into a separate subject and a separate object in any kind of unambiguous way. So this finite value of h like prevents me from being able to say something about like a bare object in the world. I'm always kind of tied to it through my interaction. So this is how I like to picture this in case it helps. This is my silly drawing, but we have our subject and our object. We've got our guy and a tree. And on glance, these seem to be separate things. But when they're interacting and we look very closely, we see that they're actually conjoined, right? And so Planck's constant h, you can think of as literally measuring the minimum size of this irreducible overlap between subject and object. It's like Planck's constant is a kind of coupling constant. So in physics, coupling constant measures the strength of an interaction. And here it's really measuring the overlap between subject and object. So you could imagine, having an H meter and you could turn the strength of that coupling down. And as you did, the area of overlap would get smaller and smaller. And if you turned it all the way down to 0, there would be no overlap at all. And subject and object would be neatly separated, and you could recover classical physics. But H is not 0. And so we can't cut ourselves out of the picture ever. And there's a sense in which this is not so different from relativity, in case this helps anyone think about it. Like in relativity, the speed of light was always thought to be instantaneous. And then suddenly people realize like, oh, the speed of light's actually finite. And that finite magnitude of the value of the speed of light made it so that space and time could no longer be unambiguously divided. And so it's sort of the same story here, except it's also really, really different because space and time, we're still on the object side of that Cartesian split. So relativity changed drastically the way we think about like certain objects, but it left the entire framework within which we think. And here, the finite magnitude of the value of h makes it so subject and object can't be neatly divided. And now the whole framework on which modern science was built is shaken. And we have to reconsider not only how we think about the world, but also how we think about ourselves and the relation between the two. Okay, so Heisenberg, like Bohr, saw this overthrow of the Cartesian split as the key philosophical implication of quantum mechanics. He said the influence of the Cartesian division on human thought can hardly be overemphasized, but it is just this division which we have to criticize from the development of physics in our time. And he adds, this was a possibility of which Descartes could not have thought, but it makes the sharp separation between the world and the I impossible. So the subject-object split, Heisenberg said, has penetrated deeply into the human mind during the 3 centuries following Descartes, and it will take a long time for it to be replaced by a really different attitude toward the problem of reality. And he makes this great point, which is that like physicists like Einstein, who were so unwilling to accept the implications of quantum mechanics, he says one can trace the roots of their difficulty to this Cartesian partition. Like that this is just so ingrained in us that we just want some story in which there's an object and a subject and those are separate. And the amazing thing is that even today, even among physicists who, unlike Einstein, claim to accept that the world really is governed by quantum mechanics, you still see many of them working up a sweat trying to like wrestle the theory back into this Cartesian mold, which it's never going to fit because H is never going to be 0. And so in trying to hang on to that Cartesian split, we end up with a lot of misunderstanding. So for instance, like quantum theory is often portrayed as if the world is like populated by objects that come in these discrete chunks, these quanta, sitting out there in an objective third-person world. But the discreteness is not in the object. The discrete, that was Bohr's whole point. The discreteness is in the subject-object relation. And the same goes for quantum uncertainty. Like, you hear stories about in cosmology or quantum field theory or something, you hear stories about like the quantum vacuum that's like sitting out there and it's fluctuating due to uncertainty or something. And, it's producing pairs of particles and all this stuff. And there's a sense in which these stories are like sort of right enough, right? But when you take it too seriously, you run into trouble, because the uncertainty is not uncertainty about a thing in the world. It's uncertainty about which part belongs to the world and which part belongs to the observer. Okay, so Wheeler took all of this in, and in a sense, more than anyone, really, more than even Bohr and Heisenberg in a way, he appreciated and embraced how radically we have to change our thinking about reality, not only on the scale of particles and sort of laboratory measurements, but in terms of space and time and our relation to the entire universe. And Wheeler liked to envision the subject-object divide as a kind of plate glass window. So he wrote, "The quantum principle has demolished the view we once had that the universe sits safely out there, that we can observe what goes on from behind a 1-foot thick slab of plate glass without ourselves being involved in what goes on. We've learned that to observe even so minuscule an object as an electron, we have to shatter that slab of glass. We have to cross out the old word observer and replace it by the new word participator. In some strange sense, the quantum principle tells us we're dealing with a participatory universe." Okay, so the participatory universe does away with Descartes' mechanistic object, with a thing in the world that just like is what it is, independent of us. It does away with the third person story of the universe. But the key thing to see here is that you can't get rid of this third person story of the observed and then still hang on to the first person story of the observer, because these were created in one and the same move. And if we choose to accept that the world is fundamentally quantum, but we still go around like thinking that there's this stuff called consciousness, it's in the head, it's private and self-knowing, and it's using internal representations of the world, then we're walking around with this totally incoherent metaphysics where we're saying the subject-object divide is fixed and not fixed. When that plate glass window shatters, it shatters on both sides. And that's why Wheeler is only half of this story. So I needed to know what Peter Putnam was onto. And after this whole complicated series of events, I managed to track down his papers, thousands of pages of unpublished manuscripts that are tucked away in a storage unit in upstate New York, along with troves of letters between Putnam and Wheeler, and journals, the same variety of journals that Wheeler had kept. Putnam was as insane of a note taker as Wheeler was. He just had much, much worse handwriting. And between the two of them, if they were having a conversation, Wheeler was taking notes on what Putnam was saying, and Putnam was taking notes on what Wheeler was saying. And now I had both sets of notes and could reconstruct like every conversation they ever had. I could also start to reconstruct Putnam's theory, which turned out to be at once a model of how the brain works, but also like an entire philosophical system. His papers are incredibly miserable and difficult to read. Everyone who knew him described his writing as Putnamese because he used language in such a weird, idiosyncratic way that it's sort of impossible to just like pick up one of the papers and read it and understand it. It's like you have to read everything he ever wrote in order to understand one sentence, which is why I've been doing this for like 10 years. But after 10 years, I have caught at least a glimpse of what he did. So if Descartes' brilliant move was to make the I self-referential, then Putnam's brilliant move was to undo it. So in paper after paper, he lays out this model of brain function that's not self-referential. When Descartes made the I self-referential, when he said it can only know itself, it became the case that it could only know the world through making this little mental model of the world in its head. And so Descartes said, I'm certain I can have no knowledge of what's outside me except by means of the ideas I have within me, right? And Descartes called these ideas cerebral impressions. And today, most cognitive scientists call them mental representations. And representations are the central idea of basically all of mainstream cognitive science. It's the basis for the idea that the brain works as a kind of computer, that it's doing computations on these mental representations. There's this famous slogan like, no computation without representation. And our experience of the world is then never really our experience of the world. It's just our experience of our internal representations of it. That was the idea. But the trouble with the whole concept of a representation is that it requires a neat, unambiguous separation between subject and object, between the subject who's doing the representing and the object that's being represented. And this is exactly the move that quantum mechanics had already undermined. So in Putnam's model, to give a very brief summary, the brain's job is no longer to represent the world. The brain's job is to wire in our history of interactions with the world so that in a given context, we will sort of spring into adaptive action. It's all about action and interaction and never about representation. So for instance, perception in his model, it becomes a matter of learning how sensory signals change relative to our bodily movements. But the result of that learning is never an image in the head. It's just a sensory motor coordination. So instead of a representation of the world, we end up with a better grip on the world, a grip that we're constantly trying to maintain through action. And in short, Putnam found a way to explain things like thought, perception, memory, imagination, all without ever invoking those private inner realms that have come to seem so fundamental and intuitive to us since Descartes. The conclusion I would have you draw from this, Putnam wrote, is that much of what's called understanding consists in a confidence of possessing the verbal and manipulatory responses and is not something independent of these responses of which we are self-conscious and so bring into expression. There is no self-consciousness, no cosmical world in the depths of consciousness waiting to come into expression. One must learn in doing, in concrete interaction with his environment. Introspection is but an illusion. It's one of the clearer things he said. So if Wheeler got rid of this third person public it, then Putnam got rid of the first person private I. And for the first time, that opened the possibility of like a consistent post-Cartesian metaphysics that makes sense on both sides of this subject-object divide now that that plate glass has shattered. And if we look back at this figure of Wheeler's, he wrote a little caption underneath that concludes, in this participatory sense, the universe doesn't sit out there. And now with Putnam's theory, we can add, not only does the universe not sit out there, but neither does the mind sit in here. And so maybe we've found somewhere for them to meet in the middle. And clearly, Wheeler and Putnam sensed that. This is an overhead of a title slide that I found for a pair of talks that they gave together back to back at a 1975 conference at MIT. So you have Wheeler from reality to consciousness, Putnam from consciousness to reality. And yet it was soon after this conference that everything kind of went wrong. Putnam gave up on academia. He moved down south. He traded his philosophy for a broom. So what happened? Well, for one thing, Wheeler could not understand what the hell Putnam was talking about. He knew Putnam was onto something, but the Putnamese was so impossible to decipher, and Putnam made it particularly hard on Wheeler. Like, I had an interesting perspective because I had Putnam's diaries where I got to see a side of him that Wheeler never did. Putnam didn't always show his cards to Wheeler. He was incredibly mistrustful of people. There's a lot to say about this, but the short story is like his mother had drilled it into him that people were only ever interested in him for his money. And that made it impossible for him to be vulnerable enough to open up to people and really explain what he was doing, despite the fact that he desperately wanted to open up to Wheeler. At the same time, Wheeler was obsessed with a problem that I've come to call Wheeler's worry, which is, how can a participatory universe still be a shared universe? here's how Wheeler put it in the journal. Does the one who makes a quantum mechanical measurement act as agent for all the others? Right, like if I'm participating in a measurement outcome, if I'm like checking the heft of my mug and somehow now that implicates me and I can't say anything about the mug, I can only say something about our interaction, then isn't it just my mug? And how would we ever compare that to your mug? And why would we ever get the same measurement outcomes? If I'm participating in the creation of like the whole universe, like in Wheeler's U diagram, do we all live in our own private universes? And Wheeler agonized over this question. Sorry about that. He would ask things like, what troubles me more than anything else is how do observers combine their impressions to build up what we call reality? I love the way he just sort of sums up the problem here. How are acts of observer participancy fitted together? That's the central mystery. Is there any point partway between all and none on this issue? Each of us a private universe? Preposterous. Each of us see the same universe? Also preposterous. So Wheeler was really stuck, and he cared really, really deeply about this issue in a profoundly moral sense. It was incredibly important to him to think that we all live in the same universe. Any sort of specter of solipsism was really morally abhorrent to him. And he has a great quote somewhere in the journals where he says something like, I don't believe we can all live in the same world until we all live in the same universe. So there was a really deep kind of ethical imperative here for him, and an intellectual puzzle, and this drove him crazy. He was deeply perplexed. And so every time he worried about this issue, he would turn to Putnam. Like he really had the sense that Putnam somehow had the answer to this particular problem. And every time he did, Putnam did feel that he had the answer. He would try to explain to Wheeler that Wheeler was stuck because he was still invoking the old Cartesian self-referential notion of like a first-person subject. That while Wheeler had the right idea about the observed, he still had the wrong idea about the observer. But Putnam would explain it with words like this: observation is contrary to the whole philosophy of observer-participant. It's an anachronism from the old pre-quantum world that we hang on to because of grammatical compulsions we do not yet know how to get around. We must replace observation by a participatory category. St. Thomas says we know things in the act, not in their essence. And then he adds, we relate to the world as I other. This is what he said in a letter to Wheeler. I other. So Putnam's use of that phrase comes from Martin Buber. And Putnam loved Buber's classic book, I and Thou, where Buber argues that there are two attitudes with which we can relate to the world. So one is as I, it, and that would be a first-person subject meeting a third-person object, and that implies this kind of fixed and uncrossable boundary that Descartes had imposed. But the other is I, you. And when you meet the world as I, you, there is no boundary. This is not a first-person or a third-person perspective. So when Wheeler asks, like, is there any point partway between all and none? Is there anything between first person and third person? Well, yes, there is. It's second person. So second person is a genuinely participatory perspective. It straddles this divide between the I and the you. It takes place in neither alone, but in what Buber liked to call the between. So instead of starting with this fixed subject-object boundary and then trying to like figure out how you can ever cross from one side to the other, you start in the between and then enact the subject-object boundary together through your engagement in each interaction. And this is always a struggle, Buber says. It requires you to be vulnerable because the very boundaries of your own self are at stake. But in doing so, you can create something new, something that didn't already exist, but arises as a result of the interaction. So a third person, first person, I, it universe is like a block universe that just exists. and all we can do is kind of ping pong knowledge between subjects. But in a participatory second person I/you view, the universe is unfinished. It's always becoming, and it's becoming through these interactions where something new is created in the struggle. And Wheeler and Putnam struggled, but they never stopped interacting. They never backed away from their between. Even when Putnam was on his knees scrubbing toilets in Louisiana, Wheeler, who was one of the most important physicists in the world, was sending him drafts of his papers and nervously awaiting the janitor's replies. "I wish we were working side by side," Wheeler wrote to Putnam, "each at his desk, each with the same sense of deadline, each feeling this is it, each able to talk with the other when we get to a tough spot. But for you, I can believe there's not the same sense of urgency as for me. There are more years ahead, and there's a larger sense of what the whole picture is that you can still hope to capture. Still, for us both, there's the same judgment, surely, that the time has come to render the verdict, whatever it may be, staying the never-ending inspection of evidence, sure that the community would rather have an imperfect result than no result." This is in part Wheeler expressing his own fears about his own research program, and at the same time trying desperately to get Putnam to publish, because it drove him crazy that Putnam had all of these ideas and they were just piling up in these unpublished manuscripts. So Wheeler had it wrong in that letter. Putnam didn't have so many more years ahead of him. Looking back at this official portrait of Wheeler that's in the physics department at Princeton, by the time it was painted, Putnam had already been killed. But what Wheeler didn't know was that Putnam had secretly commissioned and paid for this portrait because he wanted to ensure that Wheeler's legacy lived on. And the portrait shows Wheeler writing in one of the journals, which is where he left us these clues to Putnam's work, ensuring that his legacy lived on, because it otherwise would have been forgotten. And so now it's up to us to continue their conversation. I just want to quickly sort of point out that Wheeler's ideas about the participatory universe in many ways are being carried forward by the quantum interpretation known as cubism, that's very much inspired by Wheeler. And at the same time, many of the insights in Putnam's model have been sort of unknowingly rediscovered in an approach to cognitive science known as enaction or enactivism. So these are both research programs that are aimed at understanding physics and mind without using this pre-given subject-object divide, and instead understanding things like quantum measurement and perception as the enactment of that divide in maybe this sort of second-person participatory way. But these particular programs aside, it's a much wider conversation because these issues really touch every aspect of our lives. They certainly, I'm sure, touch on the work of probably everyone here, because the whole point is that this is a fundamentally social and participatory way of understanding reality. So here's the moral of the story. You can't get to this second-person understanding of reality without making the moves that both Wheeler and Putnam made, because you have to get the object out of third person, which is what Wheeler did, and you have to get the subject out of first person, which is what Putnam did. And only then can you have this possibility of genuine intersubjectivity, genuine kind of straddling of the subject-object divide. And the key point is neither of them got there on their own. So looking back to that first encounter that I had with Putnam in Wheeler's journal, where Wheeler had drawn this U diagram and then Putnam had said it was nonsense, why did he say it was nonsense? Well, Wheeler, you can see here, described his diagram as, quote, "a symbolic representation of the universe as a self-excited system that comes into being through self-reference." And Putnam wrote to him, "What bothers me most about your diagrams is your use of the word self-reference. In fact, the nervous system is not so organized as to involve self-consciousness in any latently paradoxical sense. As St. Thomas says, we know the world in the act, not in the essence. Thought is discursive, not intuitive," etc. So he was always trying to get Wheeler to think in second person, in this I-you perspective. But then here's the great irony. Looking back through the journal, I discovered this. Wheeler was preparing one of his lectures, and in a little note, he writes, first showing of the I and the you versus Martin Buber's book, I and Thou. So this diagram of the I and the you was a play on Buber's I and you all along. And finally, I just want to end on a very different kind of image. This is a place called Morgan Swamp. It's a 2,000-acre stretch of forested wetlands on the southern shoreline of Lake Erie in Ohio. It's home to bogs and beaver ponds and vernal pools, white calla lilies and tundra swans. It's a dynamic, self-sustaining ecosystem that's been able to flourish because it's protected land. And in fact, it's one of many ecologically significant lands that still exist, cared for but seldom touched, thanks to Peter Putnam. So when Putnam died, he left all $40 million to the Nature Conservancy for this express purpose. And when I first learned that, I wondered, like, why of all the causes that he could have contributed to, why ecosystems? Like, it seems so random at first. Like, why not a physics library or a science institute or modern art? Why marshes and forests and tundra swans? But eventually it became clear. Descartes' subject-object split has reached into every aspect of our lives, into every corner of science. It's in our everyday language, it's in our folk psychology, in our just like intuitive understanding of ourselves. From Descartes, the subject-object dualism proliferated and spread into dualisms of software and hardware, brain and body, nature and nurture, value and fact, ought and is. And if we start rethinking that divide, it's going to have implications for everything from like cosmology to biology, linguistics to psychiatry, neuroscience to computer science. It can change drastically our ideas about artificial intelligence and free will. But most importantly, it changes how we see our relationship to other minds, other bodies, to other life, and to our planet. So Putnam's work, it wasn't about buildings or sculptures, no matter how heavy or beautiful they are. His work was about something else, something alive and vulnerable and unfinished. So I hope we can keep it going. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Amanda, for this fascinating talk once again. So far, we have no questions, but I think this is because you just mesmerized everyone. It was a beautiful talk. I think the questions will come in. So in the meantime, I wonder, since you mentioned that Putnam was also looking into the workings of the brain, what were his ideas on thought and thinking? And as a second question, also time. So because the H bar unit is what makes operations observables non-commutative. So in a sense, it can give an error of time, which is a different error than entropic, like an entropic increase. It's just because order matters. So whether these two aspects, whether you found something in the notes.
Yeah, those are really interesting questions. So thought, yeah, there's so much to say about this. I mean, Putnam, he had certain like phrases he would repeat, and one was, which I think he sort of paraphrased from B.F. Skinner in a way. He would say thought is verbal behavior responding to itself. But he also used language in such a weird way that verbal didn't really mean verbal, and probably none of the words really meant what they seemed to mean. So I think, like, to say it in short, he would want to say thought is a behavior. It's a behavior that we do. and that it's not something that's happening like in our heads. And so he liked to look at some kind of developmental stuff, and this is stuff that I've looked into as well, like in people like Vygotsky, and interesting kind of analyses of development in infants and young humans, where you start off in dialogue with other people, and then you eventually sort of turn that dialogue on yourself. And like Gilbert Ryle has this great passage in The Concept of Mind about like that it takes a long time for a child to learn that, like, how to prattle silently instead of prattling out loud. And the same way that, like, historically people had to learn to read out loud before they learned to read silently. Like, there's this great piece in Augustine's Confessions where he like describes all the townspeople going to see this man who had this amazing ability to like read without saying the words out loud, and they would all go watch him read because this was such a strange thing, right? Like, so it's like we have this idea that comes from kind of taking the adult modern mind as like the fundamental thing, that we hear our thoughts like in our heads. And so I think what Putnam wanted to draw out is like, this is something that happens in second person intersubjectively with other people. And then like little by little, you sort of just learn to like do it really, really quietly. And of course, like a lot of thinking is not literal, like words that you're saying to yourself, but he would just be able to give like a whole story of like, the behavior of like, as if you're going to say this word triggers this other feeling in your stomach, which triggers like your eyes to move in this particular way that you moved when you saw this thing. And, like you could tell this whole story of kind of links of associations of behaviors that drag in this whole history of meaning to you, but they're meaningful in the way that they have allowed you to have this adaptive like grip on the world, and they're not sort of metaphysically private things that are happening just inside your skull. So there's a lot to be said about that, but that's like the gist, is like he would want to say thought as a behavior, and because of that, it always straddles the subject-object divide. It's not just something happening in the subject alone. And, and he had this big emphasis on like, it's not self-referential in this way. Time. Yeah, that's a whole big story too. I mean, it's interesting because Wheeler, you did so much thinking about the physics of time. Putnam did like to say things like time is more fundamental than space in the sense, not in like an objective sense of like what's out there, but kind of in the sense that you're saying, maybe this is a stretch to connect that. I mean, he wasn't talking about like the non-commutativity of like quantum measurements, but he was saying that like, because his model is sort of, it's about like the order of behavior. It's a sort of like you do one thing after the next, and each thing like has this effect that like changes the whole system, and it might interrupt the thing you were about to do. So like the order in which you do things matters too. And he saw that sort of chain of behavior as a story about time in a way. And like space, he drawing from like Poincaré, he talked about space as like this concept that you come up with through your motor behavior. Like we understand space in terms of your movements and things, but time is more fundamental in the sense that you just have this linear order of your actions. But Wheeler didn't think that time was fundamental, so I think they disagreed in a way on that. Although they didn't get into it that much between them, but Wheeler had a big sense that time stops inside a black hole, for instance, or that just somehow it can't be fundamental. It has to be, it's not like there's this absolute clock out there like ticking along, that somehow, even time has to be participatory.
Okay, thanks so much. So there are plenty of questions now. So let's start with Ann Pender. She's saying first that this was such an amazing talk. Buber's I, though, came into my mind just because you mentioned it. Also, there's no being, any universe out there or any mind in there, and this opening up a space where both might meet. I'm reminded of the poem by Rumi, out beyond ideas of wrongdoing and right doing, there is a field, I'll meet you there. When the soul lies down in that grass, the world is too full to talk about. Ideas, language, even the phrase each other doesn't make any sense. It's more a comment, I guess.
Oh, I love that. Thank you so much. I hadn't heard that before. That's beautiful.
Okay, then let's see. Zeno had a couple of so Zeno's thread. Let's start above. So it's the comment first. The relation subject object is binary. Then he continues. Could one think of non-binary interactions as in logic, where one can think of systems that are not only binary? For example, ternary systems where one does not have complementation and dialogue. In quantum physics, there are such systems, which also implies a notion of indistinguishability. And then he continues, okay, but this is on another post. Yeah. I mean, he continues with the last comment is there is the logician Emil Post, which states that it is very difficult to think outside binary.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I mean, I think probably one of the ways that Descartes, it's like we look back now on what Descartes did, and it just doesn't even seem that radical because we're so immersed in it. But it must have been incredibly radical at the time, and it had such a profound effect so quickly. Like his physics, like displaced Aristotle's physics in universities and textbooks and things like almost immediately. I mean, it had a big effect. And then, that didn't last long because Newton came along and sort of did better physics. But Newton's was very much based on Descartes. And yeah, so this like splitting the world into this binary system must have seemed very strange when that wasn't the way of thinking before. And yet now it's kind of, we're in the opposite situation where it's hard to not think in these binaries. So I don't know. I don't know if there's like something fundamental to like which is more difficult, or if it's just like this historical contingency of like, the sort of framework we grow up in and how we're like inclined to think. I mean, but yeah, I mean, subject and object, the thing about it is it's an incredibly useful binary. So it's not like you just want to go back to Aristotle's physics, and like there's a reason that classical physics, got us to the moon, and like it's an incredibly useful tool. And the same is true of cognitive science and thinking of the brain in these representational ways and whatever. And there's been good use for it. The problem, and so Descartes was obviously picking up on something by carving the world up in that way. But I think the lesson of Wheeler's participatory quantum mechanics, Putnam's stuff, and then even looking today at things like inactivism and cubism, these different programs, the lesson is like you always need a subject-object split in any interaction, but it's just that you don't want to assume that was like a pre-given. It's something that has to come out of the interaction itself. So Wheeler actually had a great quote where he would say, he had such like specific ways of phrasing things, like there is many a game we cannot play until we draw a line with chalk on the courtyard pavement. It doesn't much matter where we draw the line, but we have to draw the line to play. And so his idea was like, you always have to make this division, right? And Bohr talked about this all the time, right? That like in order to say there was a measurement outcome, for me to be able to say, the heft of my mug, I mean, heft is not a very accurate term, but the mass of my mug, is X, I have to make that cut and take away the thing that I'm contributing to the interaction. I have to do that to say that there's a mass at all. But where I go wrong is in taking that to be absolute and then kind of lifting that into a different context of a different interaction and trying to act like it's the same mug. That's where you get into trouble in quantum mechanics. That's why everything is contextual, because it's the split itself is contextual. The split itself is just kind of an arbitrary thing that you're making in order to say there was an outcome. And it's the same with perception. If I want to say, I see the mug, I'm making a distinction between me and the mug. So I think the binary has to be there. Where you run into trouble is thinking you've actually carved the universe at its joints. Those are not the universe's joints. Those are our conceptual joints. So yeah, I don't know if that fully answers the question, but I think it's like the binary is this kind of framework we have to impose on things, but we don't want to be tricked into thinking that's how the world really is.
You. Then there's a comment by William Gee. One wonder, Alison Gopnik writes wonderfully on wonder and adults achieving it through children in the garden and the carpenter. But sorry, this is
that's the previous session.
yeah, it's a previous session. I mixed it up.
It's still interesting.
James Biran has a question. Wonderful, thanks. Did Putnam point to any biological or evolutionary evidence in support of his views on brain function?
Yes. So I think, a lot of this stuff was stuff he started writing in it started as early as the 40s. Probably he did the bulk of his work between the 50s and the early 70s. He died in the 80s, but so there's definitely some of it's a bit outdated, but yes, it's interesting. It's like a mix of, there's a lot of philosophy, and even he draws from, you saw in some of those quotes, he quotes St. Thomas, and there's a lot of and Buber and these kind of mystical texts and things. But then at the same time, he was very much immersed in neurophysiology and evolutionary biology, and much of the one paper that he ever published, it was co-authored with a physicist named Robert Fuller, who was also a Wheeler student, and it's called On the Origin of Order and Behavior, which was meant to be a play on Darwin, on the origin. And so it has this very Darwinian component to it, where you have kind of I'm trying to describe this without going into Putnamese, because I just automatically start thinking in his phrases, and it's just awful. But you've wired in these previously successful actions that you've taken in your environment. And so when you're faced with some new situation, the idea is that the brain kind of calls up in parallel all the previous actions that you might have taken that would be useful. And the kind of job of the brain is to get one of those actions out. So you have this competition, this parallel competition that has to be resolved. And his model is the whole sort of neurophysiological way that this happens. But it has a very Darwinian aspect where you're kind of previously adaptive behaviors are competing to be useful in this new scenario. And then through a kind of Hebbian reinforcement in the brain, the ones that win get reinforced, and the neural connections get stronger, and so then that's more likely to happen the next time. And so it has this whole, there's a strong link to evolutionary theory, and even in, like, he has a whole philosophy of how language works, but that's still very much tied to evolutionary history. He talks about words as having like precursors in like chromosomes, and I don't know, it's a fascinating whole body of work, but he definitely was very he was linking it to a lot of, you know, hard science, even though he was presenting it in this very kind of philosophical way.
Alex has his hand up. Alex, do you want to ask a question?
Well, actually, I want to, I wanted to mention, Amanda, that we have the 1 o'clock 1 hour session. If do you think you'll be able to join us?
I hope so. I may have to jump off at some point, but I'll try to at least be on for a little bit.
Okay, so I'll save my question for the hopes that that was one of the best talks I have ever heard in an academic setting, I have to say. Definitely the best for our boot camp. So thank you very much for that. I've got a big question that I want to ask, but I should defer to the other people in the queue right now. So.
Well, I'm very curious now.
All right.
Okay, let's go through the questions. So Patty Lather is asking, can you elaborate on the I, other, or Putnam briefly mentioned in relation to Buber's I, it, and I, thou distinction?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, this is such a deep idea, and it's something I've spent a lot of time trying to wrap my mind around, and I think there's so much to be said about it and so much more to be done with it. But the idea is very much that things happen in interaction and never belong to either pole of the interaction, but to this kind of between. So I hope this isn't too much of a digression. I think Wheeler liked to tell the story that I think kind of illustrates the idea in a way. He liked to tell a story about a game of 20 questions. So this is, if anyone's never played this game, you know, people think of a word in secret, they agree on a word, you leave the room, they pick a word, you come back in, and then you have 20 questions. They have to be yes or no binary questions that you can ask, and they have to answer, and then you have 20 questions to guess the word. So Wheeler's at a dinner party, and they're playing this game, and it's his turn to go out. And so he leaves the room, and he's standing out, and he's waiting for them to call him back in. It's kind of taking a while, which seems strange, but he comes back inside, and he starts guessing, and he says, you know, is it an animal? And somebody says no. And then he says, is it green? And someone else says no. Is it white? Someone says yes. Okay. And then as he's asking the questions, people are taking longer and longer to answer. And he can't understand what's going on. And he keeps guessing, and finally he says, is it a cloud? And the person whose turn it is to answer, like, thinks for a long minute and then says yes. And everyone like bursts into laughter. And then they explain to him that they had never picked a word. They had just agreed amongst themselves that they would answer the questions on the fly, but there was a rule that every answer you gave had to be consistent with all the previous answers, so that if challenged, you could come up with some word that would fit, you know, everything that everyone said. So it was actually much harder on the people answering the questions than on Wheeler. And Wheeler likes to tell the story because he feels like it encapsulates the meaning of quantum mechanics in some way, where the word didn't already exist in the room. The word came into creation through this interaction, but he didn't impose the word on the situation. It didn't come from him. It wasn't like projected from him. But it also wasn't really coming from the people answering, because they had to respond to his particular questions. And if he had asked different questions, they would have come up with different answers. And in the end, there would have been a different word. And it's a vulnerable situation because it could have broken down. They could have gotten themselves into some situation where they couldn't come up with a self-consistent word, and then the whole game would have ended. So it was very participatory in the sense that this thing is created through the interaction, but it doesn't belong to anyone individually. It's actually in the participation itself. And so that was the idea that he had for participatory reality, where you're saying, you know, to the electron, are you here? Are you there? Are you spin up? Are you spin down? The electron is answering on the fly. It's not that it was already decided before you asked the question, but you could have asked a different question, or you spin up along this other axis, and then you would have gotten a different answer. And so, but you're not, as the observer, it's not like you're creating reality with your mind, because the world pushes back. Like, you get an answer that you don't impose. But also, you know, the same is true in reverse. Like, it's not the electrons and it's not yours. It's something that happens in between. And so I'm sorry, there's like a lawnmower outside. I hope it's not terrible. But I can mute myself in between if it helps.
Thank you. It's fine.
But yeah, so anyway, so this idea of like, that's like a real second person I-you situation where it's not taking place inside either one of you, but in the between. And the outcome belongs to both of you. It's shared. I mean, that's the really fundamental thing, is like Wheeler wanted this shared universe. And the thing is, what you can't get is a shared universe in the classical sense, where, like, you know, if I measure the electron as spin up, then it's going to be spin up for you and you and you and you and you. And that's guaranteed by the sort of finished, polished universe that's already just sitting there. I can make a measurement, get spin up. You can make a measurement, get spin down. Like, there's nothing from my measurement that guarantees anything about yours. However, when we interact with each other, we are going to create something that's shared between us. And it could be a struggle. We're not guaranteed to come out agreeing. There's no mechanism in the world that's going to enforce agreement. But there's a possibility of something shared, because, and this is where the Putnam story comes in too, because if you take the mind to be in the head and private, then my experience of the electron is something that's like in my head that just belongs to me. And then now we're in a terrible solipsistic situation that we can't get out of, because now I have my thing in my head and you have your thing in your head, and I don't even know that you really exist because you're just a representation in my head, and vice versa. And then there's no way to get into that between. The between is off limits in that story. So in a real second person situation, you have to get the mind out of the head. It can't be representational, but you also can't have a world that's just sitting there inert, waiting to be like revealed to you. And instead it has to like come about in this participation. Sorry if that was a long rambling answer.
So Rohan asks, thanks for the amazing talk. I was wondering whether the field of inactivism is exact or just similar to Putnam's idea, and if you could elaborate on what the distinctions, if any, look like.
Sure. So they're not exactly the same, but they're very much in sympathy. So I think one difference, and I hope, I've been, you know, talking to some inactivists and kind of trying to tell them a bit about Putnam, and I'm hoping I can put together some material that they could look at, because I think there is a lot to be gained by sort of combining them. Because in activism, the main point of sympathy is that they reject the idea of mental representations. And so in a way, an activism, a lot of it is about this idea that the brain is not forming mental representation. But what they don't have is like a whole model of what the brain is doing. And Putnam has that. So I think there's a really nice convergence there. But in activism, in a lot of other ways is much more, you know, and activism started really in like the 1990s. Like the book The Embodied Mind is kind of the original work of an activism. I mean, there's some precursors in Francisco Varela and Umberto Maturana's work on autopoiesis. But so this came like well after Putnam had died, and in a way, it's like a much more well-developed program. You have many, many people. It's not like, you know, one guy in Louisiana working on this stuff, you know, while he's scrubbing toilets. So there's like a whole academic discipline, and I think it's gotten much further in certain ways, but I do think there's a lot that's in Putnam that could be useful to them. And so in activism, yeah, it's this idea that cognition is not something that happens in the head. It's something we enact. And, you know, thought and perception and memory and all these seemingly abstract, like representation hungry, like behaviors are understood in terms of sensory motor behavior, engagement with the world. It's very much about the body being embodied, and the body, I mean, in relation to this talk, is like really important to understand that like the body in an activism is not an object. It's something that spans the subject-object divide. The lived body is an activity. The body is an activity that's trying to make itself over and over and over in ways that are adaptive and that like keep a grip on the world. And so it gets around this kind of binary of subject and object in really interesting ways. And it draws from philosophical traditions like phenomenology, Merleau-Ponty, some American pragmatism, and things like that are all very sympathetic, like very much in sympathy with Putnam's work too, even though Putnam's was kind of like just his own little corner of philosophy. So yeah.
Okay, then I think a comment by Ann Pender. Adult development theory posits that we evolve through stages of consciousness where we can move from first person to second person to third person perspectives, but that it is also possible to go further and develop the capacity to integrate all of these into a deeper consciousness. Maybe this might be the between that Putnam was talking of.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I hadn't heard about that. I mean, I guess just from your description of it, like my one concern would be like Putnam made a big point of saying that our first person sense of ourselves comes later. That's not like we don't start in first person and then, right? And this is how like in a lot of cognitive science that uses representations and things like, you know, the problem of other minds or theory of mind, like this stuff comes about where you're saying like, all I have is my own first person internal like experience. And then how do I, you know, through empathy or mirror neurons or imitation or something, how do I like get some understanding of the other person into me? And so the second person is like a problem to be solved because you're starting in first person. And so what Putnam really wanted to say is like, that's not actually how we start. And if you really look at like child development and things like that, that you see that like a baby does not start off as like this isolated individual. Like that is a development that comes later. So so that would just be, I mean, just to the way that was phrased, I would just point that out, but it may be that they're much more similar than that.
Okay, then Linda asks whether you gleaned any insights into Putnam's relationships as a janitor in Louisiana.
Yeah, so I mean, his whole life there was really interesting. Yeah, in the talk I didn't go into any of his personal stuff, but so Putnam was gay, openly gay at a time that was incredibly difficult. And he actually, just as an aside, like commissioned some sculptures. There's like, for instance, in New York City in Greenwich Village, where the Stonewall Inn is. That's where the Stonewall riots took place that were like the start of the gay rights movement in the United States. He had George Siegel create a sculpture of these two same-sex couples that's like sitting outside in the park right outside the Stonewall Inn. It's still there. And that was like this huge deal at the time. You know, the media were like, this is the way they phrased it was like the first monument to homosexuals in the United States. But it turned out to be like a really meaningful, kind of bold thing to do at the time that he did. And when he went to Louisiana, he went with his partner, a man named John DeBrew, and DeBrew was Black, Putnam was white, and this is in like the early 70s. They moved to like the rural South. This is like a kind of a big deal. And when they got there, they couldn't find any housing. People wouldn't rent to them because they were an interracial gay couple. And there was this whole series of events where they ended up finally in like a trailer park, and the woman who ran the trailer park said she would pray for them. And I mean, it's wild to think that Putnam had $40 million in the bank and that this was going on. But yeah, so he ended up doing a lot of work on like civil rights. He started this organization called the Terrebonne Parish Improvement Association or something. This is in Houma, Louisiana, where he really wanted to help the Black community, like to, for instance, like get Black people on the school board, Black people on like the police board, like to have people in positions of power where like it would really make a difference in how the community operated in fighting racism. And he did some really like remarkable things. He had gone to law school in the middle of between undergrad and grad. He actually went for a few years to Yale Law because his father wanted him to be a lawyer, and then he ended up, you know, coming back to Wheeler and coming back to physics because like he was never interested in law, but he was able to use what he learned in law school to do some important work for civil rights. And so he was doing all of that while working as a janitor in Houma. But I think, you know, the thing about being a janitor was that he, sorry for the beeping here. It was like the one place where he felt people weren't trying to use him for his money, basically, because he had really developed like a real paranoia about that, understandably, based on many things that happened. But, you know, he just wanted like a pure relation with people where people just saw him as a guy, and that was it. And he said it was the best job he ever had. And yeah, I think it was like he could finally kind of breathe, strangely.
Thank you. Okay, we have 3 more questions left. We have a question also by Joyce and by Alex, a big important question. So, and we have 1 minute left. So what do we do?
I was going to save my question for later. So
okay, so Amanda, you have to come. So.
Okay.
Why don't we go to Joyce, because Joyce had her hand up earlier.
No, I'm sorry. First, thank you, Amanda, so much for the beautiful talk. Sorry, I have a dissertation defense for students, so I can't make the questions. So thank you for giving me the chance to raise my question. It's actually more about comments. I wonder where can we read more documentation about those stories and, you know, if possible, like those documentation about something like we don't know about Bootcamp, because it's interesting. Your talk is very interesting. It's kind of like synchronicity in quantum theory in some way, because I kind of touched a tiny bit of him, but don't really know him at all from maybe 2 decades ago when I was in neuroscience class as a student and was doing some like computational model, but I didn't go that route, but this was a required course, and I did a little project with a classmate. and trying to do the hidden like computational connectionist the network and so on. But then I was looking through and trying to find why we can't do something more about interpretation. But it was in Putman's idea. I think I read it from some strange place, but it's just a name. Like never was. It was like those treasure left in this in the history. I feel like it's great. You could help like document all this, and we can read more about those treasures. And even in the activism too, and typically in cog science, recognized more in the 19th how those being more articulate. Never was like Putman wasn't really a key figure, but yeah, there was like those idea half a century earlier, too earlier maybe. But
Yeah.
it's very interesting. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I had a little technological glitch in the middle there, but so I missed a few sentences of what you said, but hopefully I got most of it. Yeah, I mean, I think he was way ahead of his time, and I think he was like in a way too far ahead of his time. I mean, when he was working on this stuff was exactly when the mainstream view of cognitive science as, the brain is the computer and all this stuff, that was coming up right at the same time, and much of it at Princeton when he was at Princeton. So he was really fighting the tide, and, he gave this talk. I showed that slide with his talk with Wheeler. They gave those at MIT at a neuroscience conference at MIT. MIT was like, the headquarters of this representational view of the mind. So I think he was having a hard time gaining any kind of traction because it was a little too early, and these ideas have really come to flourish much later. In terms of documentation, so I have been working on a book, but it's a ways off still. But there's a guy named Barry Spinello who knew Putnam. He's a filmmaker, and he knew Putnam back in New York in the 60s. And he's created a website that's, I believe it's just peterputnam.org, where he posted a number of the papers. They're just sort of scans of the papers. And so you can find some of the stuff, which is cool. I mean, there's the one published paper on the origin of order and behavior that I think was published in like General Systems in 1966, I believe. So there's a few things out there that you can find. But yes, so much of it is like, just piles of unpublished stuff. So I'm hoping I can maybe put together more of a digital archive at some point. But there's enough that you could certainly get a sense of his writing style, which I apologize in advance for how.
I think there are two things like I feel can be really a good lexi for the field is like one is collecting, a lot of ideas are developed independently over the history. It's like just so common in history. And but it's interesting to see whether there are any kind of connections like between those ideas. And second is I'm curious too, this was asked by another participant there. It's like how he personally choose, right, with all this philosophy, understanding about the world and self and everything, how he potentially choose those kind of life and choice and so how that impacted his soul. It's like amazing, like that's in the diary you get hands on.
Yes. Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Looking forward to read more and chat more.
Thank you so much.